The carriage wheels had stopped turning 3 miles past, but Lady Catherine Ashworth continued to listen for their return. Snow gathered in the folds of her wedding gown, ivory silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year, now stained with mud, and her own blood from where she had stumbled in the darkness. The wind carried no sound of hooves, no jingle of harness, only the terrible certainty that Lord Pemberton's men would not be coming back for her. She pressed her back against the oak tree, its rough bark catching the delicate lace of her sleeves. How long had she been walking? The moon had shifted position twice since she had climbed from the overturned carriage, since she had realized that the accident had been no accident at all. Her fingers, numb beneath torn gloves, traced the letter hidden in her bodice, the letter that had sealed her fate the moment Pemberton discovered it. A horse approached through the mist, its rider a dark silhouette against the grey sky. Catherine's breath caught. If Pemberton had sent someone to finish what the carriage accident had failed to accomplish, she had nowhere left to run. The Duke of Ravenshollow had been returning from his estate in Yorkshire when he saw her, a figure in white collapsed against the ancient oak that marked the boundary of his lands. For a moment, he thought her a ghost, some spectre conjured by the bitter December wind. Then she moved, lifting her head with the careful dignity of a woman who had learned to hide her desperation behind perfect posture. Lady Catherine Ashworth, his rival's bride, the woman who had married Lord Pemberton 3 days ago in a ceremony that had been the talk of London society. What she concealed beneath her torn wedding gown was a truth that would destroy more than her own reputation if discovered. She had never been Pemberton's willing bride, but his prisoner, and the marriage that bound her to him was built upon a foundation of forgery and blackmail that reached into the highest circles of government. Stay with me until the truth can no longer remain hidden. The Duke dismounted without speaking, his movements deliberate and controlled. Catherine watched him approach, cataloguing the details that marked him as dangerous, the way his hand rested naturally on his sword hilt, the careful distance he maintained, the fact that he showed no surprise at finding her here. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, had always been a man who calculated his moves 3 steps ahead. "Your Grace," she whispered, the words barely audible above the wind. He removed his cloak without ceremony, settling it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body, carrying the scent of bergamot and something darker, leather perhaps, or the smoke from his estate's fires. "Lady Pemberton," he said, and she flinched at the title. "You appear to have lost your way." The irony was not lost on her. She had been lost long before tonight, lost from the moment her father's debts had made her a commodity to be traded. But Alexander could not know that. No one could know that the marriage certificate bearing her signature was a forgery, that she had been drugged senseless during the ceremony, that she had awakened as Pemberton's legal property with no memory of consenting to anything. "There was an accident," she said carefully. "The carriage overturned." His dark eyes swept the empty road, noting what she hoped he would not: the absence of wreckage, of servants, of any evidence that a carriage had ever passed this way. "Indeed. And your husband?" "Delayed in London. Business matters." The lie came easily now, after 3 days of practice. She had learned to speak Pemberton's version of events as if it were truth, had learned that survival sometimes required becoming an actress in one's own life. Alexander's expression revealed nothing, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He had always been too observant for comfort. During the years when their families had moved in the same circles, before her father's ruin and Pemberton's sudden interest in her hand, she had watched him from across ballrooms and drawing rooms, noting how he saw through the careful facades that others accepted without question. "You cannot remain here," he said. "The storm worsens." She knew what he offered: shelter, safety, the protection of his name. She also knew what accepting would cost him if the truth emerged. Alexander Blackwood and Lord Pemberton had been enemies since childhood, their rivalry rooted in politics, land disputes, and a dozen other grievances that stretched back generations. If Pemberton discovered that his bride had spent even one night under Alexander's roof, "I cannot impose upon your hospitality, your grace. If you could simply direct me to the nearest inn." "There is no inn within 10 miles, and you would not survive the journey." He moved to his horse, gathering the reins with practiced efficiency. "You will come to Raven's Hollow. In the morning, we shall send word to your husband of your safe recovery." The word husband fell between them like a stone into still water. Catherine pulled his cloak tighter, feeling the weight of the letter pressed against her ribs. Inside that folded paper lay proof that Pemberton had been selling military secrets to French agents, using his position in the War Office to fund his gambling debts. She had discovered it quite by accident while searching his study for writing materials, had recognized the significance of the coded dispatches immediately. It was the letter that had prompted her escape attempt. It was also the letter that would see her hanged for treason if anyone discovered she possessed it, unless she could find a way to expose Pemberton's crimes without implicating herself. "Your Grace is most kind," she said, accepting his offered hand to help her mount behind him. The contact sent an unexpected shock through her system, warmth, strength, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She had grown so accustomed to Pemberton's cold touch, to the way he handled her like an object to be positioned and displayed, that she had forgotten how gentle a man's hands could be. They rode in silence through the gathering storm. Catherine's arms wrapped carefully around Alexander's waist, her face pressed against the wool of his coat. She tried not to think about how right this felt, how safe she felt for the first time in months. Safety was an illusion she could not afford. Tomorrow, she would have to return to her role as Pemberton's devoted wife, would have to smile and curtsy, and pretend that her marriage was everything society expected it to be. Tonight, however, she would allow herself this brief respite from performance. Raven's Hollow emerged from the mist like something from a fairy tale, all Gothic towers and diamond-paned windows glowing with warm light. Catherine had visited here once as a child, when her father and the late Duke had been friends, before politics and pride had driven their families apart. She remembered the library with its soaring ceilings, the conservatory where exotic flowers bloomed even in winter, the sense of permanence that seemed to emanate from every stone. "Mrs. Hartwell will see to your needs," Alexander said as they dismounted in the courtyard. "I have taken the liberty of sending word ahead." A woman emerged from the servants' entrance, tall, grey-haired, with the bearing of someone who had managed great households for decades. She took in Catherine's appearance with a single glance, her expression revealing nothing but professional concern. "Your ladyship," Mrs. Hartwell said, offering a slight curtsy. "If you would follow me, I have prepared the rose chamber. A bath has been drawn, and I have laid out some suitable garments." Catherine hesitated, looking back at Alexander. In the torchlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, unreadable as carved stone. "Your Grace, Rest," he said simply. "We shall speak in the morning." She wanted to tell him that morning would bring only complications, that every hour she remained here increased the danger to them both. Instead, she followed Mrs. Hartwell into the warmth of Raven's Hollow, feeling the weight of Alexander's gaze upon her back, until the door closed between them. The rose chamber was everything its name suggested. Soft pink wallpaper, delicate furniture, windows that would overlook the gardens in daylight. Mrs. Hartwell moved efficiently about the room, laying out a nightgown of fine lawn, arranging toiletries on the dressing table. "The bath is through here, my lady," she said, indicating a door that led to a small chamber where steam rose from a copper tub. "I took the liberty of adding some lavender oil. It should help with any distress from your ordeal." Catherine almost smiled at the careful euphemism. Mrs. Hartwell had clearly noted the state of her wedding gown, the way she moved, as if every step caused pain, the careful way she held herself. How much had Alexander told her? How much had she guessed? "You are very kind, Mrs. Hartwell. I fear I am not. That is, my circumstances are rather—" "His Grace has explained that you suffered a carriage accident, my lady. Nothing more need be said. The housekeeper's tone was gentle but firm. Ravenshollow has always been a place of sanctuary for those who have need of it. When she was alone, Catherine sank into the hot water with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. For the first time in 3 days, she allowed herself to truly feel the fear she had been holding at bay. Pemberton would be searching for her by now. He would have discovered her absence, would know that she had taken the letter. He would not rest until he found her, and when he did, she touched her throat, remembering the pressure of his fingers there on their wedding night, the cold promise in his voice when he had explained exactly what would happen if she ever tried to leave him. But she was not the same terrified girl who had awakened in his bed 3 days ago. She had the letter now, had proof of his crimes. If she could find a way to expose him without destroying herself in the process, she might yet find freedom. The question was whether she could accomplish this without destroying Alexander as well. She dressed in the nightgown Mrs. Hartwell had provided, noting its quality, its perfect fit. Someone had taken great care to ensure her comfort, had anticipated her needs with thoughtful precision. When had anyone last shown her such consideration? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come," she called, expecting Mrs. Hartwell. Instead, Alexander entered carrying a tray that held a teapot, 2 cups, and what appeared to be a plate of small cakes. He had changed from his riding clothes into a dark blue dressing gown, his hair slightly damp, as if he too had bathed. The intimacy of the moment struck her immediately. They were alone, both in nightclothes, with no chaperone save the flickering candlelight. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the small table near the window. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that you had refused dinner." "I was not. That is, I found I had little appetite." Catherine remained by the fire, acutely aware of how the thin nightgown must appear in the firelight, how improper this entire situation was. "Your Grace, you should not be here." "If anyone were to discover, no one will discover anything," he said quietly, pouring tea with the same careful precision he brought to everything. "The servants are discreet, and you are under my protection." The word protection hung between them, loaded with implications neither could speak aloud. Catherine accepted the cup he offered, noting how he was careful not to let their fingers touch, how he maintained a proper distance, even in this most improper of circumstances. "You have questions," she said, because his silence was more unnerving than any interrogation would have been. "I have many questions. I suspect you have few answers you can safely give." He settled into the chair across from her, his own cup cradled in long fingers. "Tell me what you can, Catherine. Tell me how I may help you." The use of her given name sent warmth spiraling through her chest. How long since anyone had spoken to her with such gentle familiarity? Pemberton called her wife when he was pleased with her, madam when he was not. Her given name had become a stranger to her own ears. "I fear there is little help to be given, Your Grace. That is, my situation is quite fixed." "Fixed?" He repeated the word as if testing its weight. "You speak as if you were a mathematical equation rather than a woman with choices." If only he knew how accurate that assessment was. She had become exactly that, a problem to be solved, a variable in Pemberton's larger calculations. Her value lay not in her person, but in her connections, her father's former position in the Admiralty, the secrets she might overhear in her role as a dutiful wife. "Some choices, once made, cannot be unmade," she said carefully, "and some choices are made for us, without our consent or knowledge." His dark eyes met hers across the small table. "Which category does your marriage fall into, Catherine?" The question was so direct, so dangerously close to the truth, that she nearly dropped her teacup. Alexander was watching her with the intensity of a man who had built his reputation on reading the subtleties others missed, who had survived years of political intrigue by understanding what people revealed in their silences. "I married Lord Pemberton of my own free will," she said, the rehearsed words feeling like ash in her mouth. "Did you?" 2 words, spoken so quietly they were barely audible above the crackling fire, Two words that contained a universe of understanding, of recognition, of something that might have been compassion. Catherine set down her cup with trembling fingers. "Your Grace, you need not lie to me," he said gently. "Whatever brought you to my lands tonight, whatever circumstances led to your accident, you are safe here. That is all that matters at present." Safe. The word was a luxury she had almost forgotten existed, but safety was temporary, and morning would bring the necessity of choice. She could not remain here, could not allow Alexander to be drawn into the web of danger that surrounded her. Yet she could not return to Pemberton empty-handed, could not face his rage without some plan for survival. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped. How did one ask a man to help destroy his enemy without revealing the full scope of one's own crimes? How did one confess to theft and espionage while maintaining even a pretense of innocence? "Alexander," he corrected softly. "We are far beyond the need for such formality, I think. Alexander." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate and forbidden. "If you knew, that is, if you discovered that someone you trusted was not what they appeared to be, what would you do?" He considered this, turning his teacup slowly in its saucer. "That would depend entirely on the nature of their deception. A lie told to protect others is quite different from one told for personal gain. And if the deception involved matters of national importance..." His stillness was absolute, the kind of perfect control that spoke of years of training in diplomacy and statecraft. When he looked at her again, she saw not the gentle man who had offered her shelter, but the duke who had advised kings and toppled governments with a carefully placed word. "Then I would want to be very certain of my facts before taking any action," he said. "Such matters have a way of destroying the innocent along with the guilty." Catherine nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. Whatever she was contemplating, whatever dangerous game she was playing, she must be prepared for the consequences. The letter pressed against her ribs seemed to burn with the weight of the secrets it contained. "I should retire," she said, rising from her chair. "You have been more than kind, and I would not wish to impose further upon your hospitality." Alexander stood as well, his movements fluid and controlled. "Catherine," he said as she moved toward the bed, "whatever you are carrying, whatever burden you bear, you need not carry it alone." She turned back to him, memorizing the way the firelight played across his features, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the steadiness in his eyes that spoke of honor and integrity. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between her own survival and his safety. Tonight, she would allow herself to imagine what it might be like to trust someone completely, to lay down the weight of her secrets and simply rest. "Good night, Alexander," she whispered. "Good night, Catherine. Sleep well." After he had gone, she lay awake, listening to the storm rage outside her windows. Somewhere in London, Pemberton was discovering her absence, was perhaps already planning his response. Somewhere in this very house, Alexander was likely doing the same, calculating the risks, weighing the implications of harboring his enemy's wife. Neither man knew about the letter hidden in her bodice, about the proof of treason that could topple governments and destroy lives. Neither man knew that she had already made her choice, that she would use whatever weapons came to hand to secure her freedom, regardless of the cost. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, it was not thoughts of strategy or survival that filled her mind. Instead, she found herself remembering the warmth of Alexander's cloak around her shoulders, the gentle way he had spoken her name, the promise of safety in his dark eyes. It was a promise she would not allow him to keep. Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through diamond-paned windows and the sound of voices in the courtyard below. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the circumstances that had brought her here. Then memory returned with the force of a physical blow, and she was out of bed, moving to the window to see what had caused the commotion. 3 riders in Pemberton's livery sat their horses in the courtyard, their leader engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Alexander. Even at this distance, she could see the tension in Alexander's posture, the way his hand rested casually near his sword hilt, He was listening with the careful attention of a man who expected treachery. A soft knock at her door made her step back from the window. "Come," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Mrs. Hartwell entered with a breakfast tray and an expression of careful neutrality. "Good morning, my lady. I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you." Catherine watched the housekeeper's face for any sign of what was transpiring below. "I could not help but notice. That is, there seemed to be visitors in the courtyard." "Indeed, my lady. Gentlemen from Lord Pemberton's household, inquiring after your welfare. His Grace is handling the matter personally." Handling the matter. Catherine wondered what that meant, what Alexander was telling Pemberton's men, what story he was constructing to explain her presence here. She moved to the wardrobe, where Mrs. Hartwell had hung the gown she had worn yesterday, cleaned and pressed, but still bearing the subtle signs of her ordeal. "Mrs. Hartwell, might I ask, that is, has His Grace mentioned when I might be able to return to London?" The housekeeper's hands stilled in their arrangement of the breakfast things. "I believe His Grace intends to discuss that matter with you directly, my lady. He has asked that you join him in the library when you are ready." The library. Catherine remembered it from her childhood visit. A vast room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, dominated by a massive desk that had belonged to Alexander's grandfather. It was a room designed for serious conversations, for matters of weight and consequence. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple morning gown of pale blue that Mrs. Hartwell had somehow procured. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and she wondered briefly whose wardrobe it had come from. Alexander had never married, but that did not mean there had been no women in his life, no feminine touches in his household. The thought brought an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy, which was both inappropriate and dangerous. She had no claim on Alexander's affections, no right to wonder about his past attachments. She was a married woman, regardless of the circumstances of that marriage, and he was offering her sanctuary, nothing more. The library was exactly as she remembered it, save for the man who now occupied the space behind the great desk. Alexander looked up as she entered, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betraying a tension that had not been there the night before. "Catherine," he said, rising to greet her, "I trust you slept well as could be expected given the circumstances." She remained near the door, suddenly uncertain of her welcome. "I understand there have been inquiries about my welfare." "Your husband's men came at first light," Alexander said, his tone neutral. "They were quite concerned about your disappearance." "And what did you tell them?" "The truth as far as it goes. That I found you on my lands after a carriage accident, that you were injured and in need of assistance, that you spent the night here under the protection of my household." He moved around the desk to face her directly. "They seemed skeptical of certain details." Catherine's heart sank. Of course they would be skeptical. Pemberton's men were not fools, and the story of a carriage accident that left no trace, no wreckage, no injured horses or servants would not bear close scrutiny. "What did they want?" she asked. "To escort you back to London immediately. I informed them that you were not yet well enough to travel, that my physician had advised rest." Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "They were insistent. And you?" "I was more insistent." The quiet steel in his voice reminded her that for all his gentle manner, Alexander Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. "You are under my protection, Catherine. That protection extends until you choose to leave it." The words sent warmth flooding through her chest, followed immediately by a sharp stab of guilt. He was offering her exactly what she needed: time, safety, the shelter of his name and reputation. He was also placing himself in terrible danger, creating an enemy of one of the most powerful men in England, all for a woman who had not been entirely honest with him. "Alexander," she began, then stopped. Then, how could she explain that his protection was built on a foundation of lies, that every moment she remained here increased the risk to his own safety and reputation? "There is something you wish to tell me," he said, and it was not a question. She looked around the library. at the thousands of volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and wisdom, at the portraits of his ancestors who gazed down with expressions of noble purpose. This was a room where important decisions were made, where matters of honor and duty were weighed and measured. "If I were to tell you something," she said carefully, "something that might complicate your position, would you still wish to hear it?" Alexander moved to the window that overlooked the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. That would depend entirely on the nature of the complication. Catherine joined him at the window, noting how he shifted slightly to maintain a proper distance between them. Even in private, even in the midst of circumstances that had already shattered most conventions, he was careful to observe the proprieties. It was both admirable and heartbreaking. "What if I told you that my marriage to Lord Pemberton was not, that is, what if the circumstances were not as they appeared? I would say that I had already suspected as much." His reflection in the window glass met her eyes. "The question is whether you are prepared to tell me the truth, or whether you prefer to continue with careful euphemisms." The directness of his response caught her off guard. She had expected questions, demands for explanation, perhaps even accusations. Instead, he was offering her the choice to confess or remain silent, trusting her to make the decision that was right for both of them. "The truth is dangerous," she said quietly. "More dangerous than the lies you are currently living?" She thought of Pemberton's hands around her throat, of the cold promise in his voice, of the letter hidden in her bodice that could see them both hanged for treason. "Yes," she whispered, "much more dangerous." Alexander turned from the window to face her directly. "Then perhaps it is time to share that danger rather than bearing it alone." The temptation was overwhelming. To tell him everything, about the forged marriage certificate, about the letter, about Pemberton's crimes and her own desperate plan for survival. To lay down the weight of her secrets and trust in his strength, his honor, his ability to find a solution where she could see none. But she had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in such simple salvation. Alexander was offering to share her burden, but he did not understand the true weight of what he was taking on. If she told him the truth, she would be asking him to choose between his honor and his safety, between his duty to the crown and his desire to protect her. It was a choice no honorable man should have to make. "I cannot," she said, stepping back from the window. "I cannot ask you to—" "You are not asking," he interrupted gently. "I am offering." The distinction mattered, she realized. He was not responding to her pleas or manipulations, but making his own choice based on his own assessment of the situation. It was the difference between charity and partnership, between pity and respect. "If I tell you," she said slowly, "there will be no going back. You will know things that could destroy you, that could bring down everything you have worked to build. And if you do not tell me, you will continue to face those same dangers alone, with no ally save your own courage." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Which of us do you think is better equipped for such a battle?" The question was not about her capabilities, she realized, but about trust. Was she willing to trust him with the truth? Was she willing to believe that together they might find a solution that neither could achieve alone? Before she could answer, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but Lady Pemberton has a visitor." Catherine's blood turned to ice. "A visitor?" "Lady Pemberton's sister, my lady, Miss Ashworth. She arrived not 10 minutes ago, quite distraught about your disappearance." "Margaret." Catherine's heart sank, even as relief flooded through her. Her younger sister was the one person in the world who knew the truth about her marriage, who had tried desperately to prevent the ceremony from taking place. She was also impulsive, emotional, and entirely capable of saying something that would expose everything Catherine was trying to hide. "Where is she now?" Alexander asked. "In the morning room, Your Grace. I took the liberty of offering refreshment, but she seems quite agitated." Catherine looked at Alexander, seeing her own concern reflected in his expression. Margaret's arrival changed everything, added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. I should see her, Catherine said. Alone, if possible. Of course. Alexander moved toward the door, then paused. Catherine, whatever your sister knows, whatever she might say, it will not change my offer of protection. Udid. The words were meant to be reassuring, but they only increased Catherine's anxiety. Alexander was making promises based on incomplete information, offering guarantees he might not be able to keep once he learned the full scope of what he was dealing with. She found Margaret pacing the morning room like a caged animal, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, her eyes red with tears and sleeplessness. When she saw Catherine, she flew across the room and threw her arms around her sister's neck. Catherine, oh, thank God you are safe. When Pemberton said you had disappeared, when he showed me the overturned carriage, Margaret pulled back to study her sister's face. Are you hurt? Are you truly well? I am well enough, Catherine said, gently extricating herself from her sister's embrace. But Margaret, what are you doing here? How did you know where to find me? Pemberton's men returned this morning with word that you were here at Raven's Hollow. He was quite angry, Catherine. He spoke of coming himself, of demanding your immediate return. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. He knows about the letter. Catherine's knees nearly buckled. What? He searched your room after you disappeared. He found the hiding place behind the loose brick in the fireplace, found the other papers you had taken from his study. Margaret gripped her sister's hands. Catherine, he knows everything. He knows you have been gathering evidence against him. The room seemed to spin around Catherine. She had been so careful, had thought herself so clever in her small acts of rebellion, but Pemberton had been watching, had perhaps even allowed her to discover the letter, had been planning his response from the beginning. How long? She whispered. How long has he known? I do not know, but Catherine, you cannot return to London. He will... Margaret's voice broke. He will kill you. I am certain of it. Catherine sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing through the implications. If Pemberton knew about the letter, knew about her other small thefts of information, then he also knew she posed a direct threat to his safety. He would not simply punish her for her disobedience, he would eliminate the threat entirely. There is more, Margaret said, kneeling beside her sister's chair. I overheard him speaking with someone, a man I did not recognize. They spoke of making it appear as though you had taken your own life, overcome with guilt over some imagined scandal. Suicide. It was a perfect solution from Pemberton's perspective. It would eliminate Catherine as a threat, while simultaneously discrediting any accusations she might have made against him. Who would believe the ravings of a woman so disturbed that she had taken her own life? Margaret, Catherine said carefully, you must tell me exactly what you heard, every word, every detail. As her sister recounted the conversation she had overheard, Catherine felt the last of her options slipping away. She could not return to London. That much was clear. But she could not remain at Raven's Hollow either, not without bringing Pemberton's wrath down upon Alexander and his household. She was trapped, caught between the certainty of death if she returned, and the certainty of destroying an innocent man if she stayed. There is something else, Margaret said when she had finished her account. The man Pemberton was speaking with. I had seen him before, Catherine. He was at the Admiralty in Father's office, just before Father's disgrace. Catherine's blood chilled. If Pemberton's associate had been involved in their father's downfall, if the web of corruption reached that far back, then the danger was even greater than she had imagined. Margaret, you must leave here immediately, she said, rising from her chair. You must return to London and pretend you never found me, never spoke to me. I will not leave you. You will, because if you do not, we will both be dead before the week is out. Catherine gripped her sister's shoulders. Promise me, Margaret. Promise me you will go home and say nothing of what you have learned. Before Margaret could answer, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His expression was carefully neutral, but Catherine could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes moved between the two sisters, as if calculating the implications of what he had overheard. Forgive the interruption, he said, but I thought you should know Lord Pemberton has just arrived. At this moment would you have told the truth? The sound of horses in the courtyard was like thunder in the sudden silence that fell over the morning room. Catherine moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Pemberton dismount from his black stallion. Even at this distance, she could see the controlled fury in his movements, the way he surveyed Ravenshollow's facade as if memorizing every detail for future retribution. He had brought only 2 men with him, a calculated choice that spoke of confidence rather than caution. He did not expect resistance, did not anticipate that Alexander would dare to stand between him and his legal property. "Margaret," Catherine said without turning from the window, "you will go with Mrs. Hartwell to the servants' quarters. You will remain there until this matter is resolved." "Catherine, I cannot—" "You can, and you will." Catherine's voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Alexander, if you would be so kind as to escort my sister—" "I think not," Alexander said quietly. "Miss Ashworth may indeed seek safety with my housekeeper, but I shall remain here. This is my house, and Lord Pemberton is my guest, however unwelcome." The words were spoken with perfect courtesy, but their meaning was unmistakable. Alexander was choosing to stand with her, to face whatever Pemberton brought with him. The knowledge filled Catherine with equal parts gratitude and terror. Margaret looked between them, her young face pale with understanding. "Catherine, the letter is safe," Catherine said firmly. "Now go." When they were alone, Alexander moved to stand beside her at the window. Pemberton was speaking with his men, issuing instructions that would likely involve securing the perimeter, ensuring that no one could leave Ravenshollow without his knowledge. "He knows," Catherine said simply, "about the letter, about everything. My sister brought word. He has been watching me, waiting for me to reveal the full extent of what I know." Alexander's expression did not change, but she felt, rather than saw, his increased attention. What letter? This was the moment of truth, the point at which she must choose between her own safety and his. Catherine reached into her bodice, withdrawing the folded paper that had been pressed against her heart since her escape from London. "Proof of treason," she said, placing it in his hands. "Military secrets sold to French agents, coded dispatches, financial records that trace the payments directly to Pemberton's personal accounts." Alexander unfolded the letter with careful hands, his eyes moving rapidly across the coded text. She watched his expression change as he recognized the significance of what he was reading, saw the moment when he understood the full scope of the danger they were facing. "Dear God," he breathed. "Catherine, do you understand what this means? This information could see us both hanged for treason, yes." Catherine took the letter back, refolding it with practiced efficiency. "If Pemberton claims that I stole these documents, that I was the one selling secrets to the French, who would believe my word against his?" The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Pemberton's arrival. Catherine had just enough time to conceal the letter once more before the morning-room door opened to admit her husband. Lord Pemberton was a man who commanded attention through sheer force of will rather than physical presence. Of medium height and unremarkable features, he possessed the kind of cold intelligence that made strong men step aside and wise men choose their words carefully. When he looked at Catherine, she saw no warmth, no relief at finding her safe, only the calculating assessment of a man who viewed her as a problem to be solved. "My dear wife," he said, his voice carrying perfectly across the room. "What a relief to find you safe and well. When my men reported the carriage accident, I feared the worst." "Lord Pemberton," Alexander said, stepping slightly forward, "I trust your men explained the circumstances of your wife's rescue?" Pemberton's pale eyes shifted to Alexander, and Catherine felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Indeed they did, Your Grace. Most illuminating. I confess myself curious about certain details of this rescue, such as the remarkable absence of any evidence of this alleged accident. No wreckage, no injured horses, no servants who might corroborate the tale." Pemberton moved further into the room, his movements predatory and controlled. "One might almost think my wife had simply wandered away from her proper place." The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke Alexander into an unguarded response. Catherine held her breath, watching the two men face each other across the elegant morning room like duelists measuring the distance between them. "Your wife was found injured and in distress on my lands," Alexander said with perfect calm. "I offered her the protection of my household as any gentleman would do. If you question my motives or my honor in this matter, perhaps we should discuss it more privately." The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. Pemberton heard it, considered it, and chose to ignore it in favor of his larger objective. "How thoughtful of you, Your Grace. I am certain Catherine is most grateful for your protection." He turned to her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Are you not, my dear?" Catherine understood the trap immediately. If she expressed too much gratitude, Pemberton would use it as evidence of improper intimacy. If she showed too little, he would claim she was being held against her will. "His Grace has been most kind," she said carefully. "I am ready to return to London whenever you wish." "Excellent. We shall depart within the hour." "I think not," Alexander said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Pemberton turned slowly to face him, his expression shifting from cold amusement to something far more dangerous. "I beg your pardon? My physician has advised that Lady Pemberton should rest for several more days before attempting the journey to London. I cannot in good conscience allow her to travel in her current condition." It was a masterful response, perfectly reasonable, medically sound, and completely infuriating to a man who was accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. "How fortunate that my wife has such a concerned protector," Pemberton said. "However, I believe I'm the better judge of my wife's condition and capabilities." "Are you?" Alexander's tone remained conversational, but Catherine could hear the steel beneath the silk. "Forgive me, but you were not present when she was found. You did not see the state she was in, the extent of her injuries." "Injuries?" Pemberton's voice sharpened. "What injuries?" "My men reported no serious harm." Catherine realized that Alexander was deliberately provoking Pemberton, forcing him to reveal the extent of his knowledge about her escape. If Pemberton knew there had been no carriage accident, if he knew she had fled deliberately, then his reaction to the mention of injuries would expose that knowledge. "Perhaps," Alexander said, "you should ask your wife about her injuries. She is, after all, the one who suffered them." All eyes turned to Catherine. She could feel the weight of their attention, the careful calculation behind each man's gaze. Pemberton was waiting for her to contradict Alexander's story, to reveal that there had been no accident, no injuries, save those he had inflicted himself. Alexander was trusting her to support his deception, to play the role of grateful victim. The truth was more complex than either man knew. She had been injured, not in any carriage accident, but in her desperate flight through the woods, in her struggle to escape the men Pemberton had sent to retrieve her. The cuts on her hands, the bruises on her arms, the exhaustion that had nearly claimed her life, all of it was real, even if its cause was not what Alexander believed. "I was shaken," she said finally. "The accident was quite frightening. His Grace's physician was most thorough in his examination. It was not quite a lie, though it was certainly not the whole truth." Pemberton's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, searching for signs of deception. "Indeed," he said slowly. "And what, precisely, did this examination reveal?" The question was a trap, designed to force her into either admitting there had been no accident or describing injuries that would contradict her story. Catherine felt the walls closing in around her, felt the careful balance she had maintained beginning to crumble. "Shock," Alexander said before she could answer. "Exhaustion. Several minor cuts and bruises consistent with being thrown from a carriage. Nothing that will not heal with proper rest." "How convenient that you are so well informed about my wife's condition," Pemberton said. "One might almost think you had examined her personally." The implication was clear and deliberately offensive. Catherine saw Alexander's hands clench at his sides, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten with the effort of maintaining his composure. "Dr. Morrison is a man of unimpeachable reputation," Alexander said. If you question his professional assessment, you are welcome to summon your own physician for a second opinion. That will not be necessary. Pemberton moved closer to Catherine, close enough that she could smell the cologne he favored, could see the cold satisfaction in his pale eyes. I am certain my wife is eager to return home, to resume her proper duties. The emphasis on proper duties made Catherine's skin crawl. She knew exactly what he meant, knew what awaited her if she returned to London under his power. Actually, she said, surprising herself with her own boldness, I find myself quite fatigued still. Perhaps another day or two of rest would be advisable. Pemberton's expression went very still. I think not, my dear. You have imposed upon His Grace's hospitality quite long enough. Lady Pemberton is welcome to remain at Ravenshollow for as long as necessary, Alexander said. I consider her recovery my personal responsibility. The two men stared at each other across the morning room, the air between them crackling with unspoken threats. Catherine realized that she was witnessing something more than a dispute over her person. This was a test of wills between two powerful men, each determined to prove his dominance over the other. How noble of you, Pemberton said finally. However, I must insist. My wife's place is at my side, not hiding in the country like some fugitive. The word fugitive was chosen deliberately, a reminder that Catherine had fled from him, that her presence here was the result of her own defiance rather than any accident. It was also a warning. He knew she had taken something that belonged to him, and he would not rest until he recovered it. Then perhaps, Alexander said quietly, we should ask Lady Pemberton what she prefers. Catherine felt both men's attention focus on her with laser intensity. This was the moment of choice, the point at which she must decide whether to trust in Alexander's protection or submit to Pemberton's will. She thought of the letter hidden against her heart, of the proof of treason that could destroy them all. She thought of Margaret's warning, of Pemberton's plan to stage her suicide. She thought of Alexander's offer of protection, of the gentle way he had spoken her name, of the warmth in his dark eyes. She began, then stopped as she saw something shift in Pemberton's expression. He was no longer looking at her with cold calculation, but with the satisfied smile of a man who held all the winning cards. Before you answer, my dear, he said softly, perhaps you should know that I have had the most interesting conversation with your father. Catherine's blood turned to ice. My father? Indeed. He was most concerned when he learned of your disappearance. So concerned, in fact, that he felt compelled to share certain information about your recent activities. Pemberton's smile widened. Information about documents that have gone missing from my study, about a daughter who has been playing at espionage. The trap was sprung. Catherine saw it now, saw how completely she had been outmaneuvered. Pemberton had not come here to retrieve a wayward wife. He had come to expose a traitor, to destroy her credibility before she could use the letter against him. I have no idea what you mean, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Do you not? Then perhaps you would not mind if His Grace's servants searched your belongings? I am certain they would find nothing incriminating. Alexander was looking between them with growing understanding, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he began to grasp the true nature of the game being played. What are you suggesting, Pemberton? He asked. I am suggesting that my wife has been stealing sensitive documents from my study, documents related to my work at the War Office. I'm suggesting that her presence here is not the result of any accident, but of a deliberate attempt to pass those documents to interested parties. The accusation hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Catherine saw her carefully constructed story crumbling, saw the doubt creeping into Alexander's eyes as he began to question everything she had told him. That is a serious charge, Alexander said slowly. Indeed it is. Treason, in fact, punishable by death. Pemberton moved closer to Catherine, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. Return what you have taken, my dear, and we shall say no more about this unfortunate episode. Continue this charade, and I will see you hanged as a French spy." Catherine looked at Alexander, seeing the conflict in his expression, the way he was struggling to reconcile the woman he had sheltered with the accusations being leveled against her. She had brought this danger into his house, had allowed him to risk his reputation and safety for a lie. The letter pressed against her ribs like a burning coal, a reminder of the choice she faced. She could surrender it to Pemberton, could confess to theft and throw herself on his mercy, or she could trust in Alexander's protection, could reveal the truth about Pemberton's crimes and hope that justice would prevail. But justice was a luxury for those who could afford it, and Catherine had learned long ago that the world rarely rewarded truth over power. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Time is a luxury you no longer possess," Pemberton replied. "Choose now, Catherine. Return to London as my dutiful wife, or remain here as a confessed traitor. But choose quickly. My patience is not infinite." The ultimatum was clear: submit or be destroyed, return to a life of captivity and abuse, or face the gallows as a spy. Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the letter against her heart, the weight of Alexander's trust, the weight of her sister's safety. When she opened them again, her decision was made. But it was not the decision either man expected. "I choose truth," Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the morning room. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Pemberton's satisfied smile faltered, replaced by something that might have been genuine surprise. Alexander straightened, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, and strangely free. "Catherine," Pemberton said, his tone carrying a warning that was unmistakable, "consider carefully what you are about to do." "I have considered." She moved to the center of the room, placing herself equidistant from both men, belonging to neither. "I have considered the cost of silence, the price of lies, the weight of carrying secrets that could destroy innocent lives." She reached into her bodice, withdrawing the letter with steady hands. Alexander's eyes widened as he recognized the document, while Pemberton's face went very still. "This letter," Catherine said, holding it up so both men could see it clearly, "contains proof that Lord Pemberton has been selling military secrets to French agents. Coded dispatches, troop movements, supply routes, all sold to fund his gambling debts and maintain his lifestyle." "You little fool," Pemberton breathed, his mask of civilized control finally slipping. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" "I have told the truth," Catherine replied, "something I should have done the moment I discovered your crimes." Alexander stepped forward, his hand extended. "May I?" Catherine placed the letter in his hands, watching his face as he read the damning evidence it contained. She saw the moment when he recognized the significance of what he was holding, saw the way his expression hardened as he understood the full scope of Pemberton's betrayal. "These dispatches," Alexander said slowly, "they detail the movements of Wellington's forces in Spain. If this information reached the French, hundreds of British soldiers would have died," Catherine finished, "perhaps thousands, all so that Lord Pemberton could pay his debts to certain unsavory creditors." Pemberton laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "Touching, my dear, but you seem to have forgotten one crucial detail, which is, you are my wife. Under English law, you are my property, as are any documents in your possession. That letter belongs to me, and any accusations you make are merely the ravings of a hysterical woman." His pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Who do you think the authorities will believe, a peer of the realm, or a woman who has already demonstrated her instability by fleeing from her lawful husband?" The truth of his words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had been so focused on exposing his crimes that she had forgotten the fundamental reality of her position. As a married woman, she had no legal standing, no right to own property or make accusations against her husband. "However," Pemberton continued, "I am not without mercy. Return to London with me now, submit to your proper role as my wife, and I will overlook this temporary madness. Continue this charade, and I will have you committed to Bedlam as a lunatic who poses a danger to herself and others. Catherine felt the walls closing in around her once again. Even in revealing the truth, even in choosing courage over safety, she had only succeeded in trapping herself more completely. "There is, however, one flaw in your reasoning," Alexander said quietly. Pemberton turned to him with raised eyebrows. "Indeed? You assume that Lady Pemberton is the only person who possesses evidence of your crimes." Alexander moved to his desk, withdrawing a key from his waistcoat pocket. "You assume that this letter is the only proof of your treachery?" He unlocked a drawer and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on the desk where both Catherine and Pemberton could see it. "For the past 6 months," Alexander said, "I have been investigating irregularities in certain military dispatches, discrepancies that suggested information was being leaked to enemy agents. Your name appeared frequently in my inquiries, Lord Pemberton, though I lacked the final proof needed to bring charges." Catherine stared at the folder, understanding beginning to dawn. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew what he was doing." "I suspected. But suspicion is not evidence, and accusations without proof are merely slander." Alexander's eyes met hers across the room. "Until now, I lacked the final piece of the puzzle." Pemberton's composure was cracking, his careful mask of aristocratic control beginning to slip. "You have nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Suspicions and theories prove nothing." "Perhaps not," Alexander agreed. "But combined with Lady Pemberton's evidence, with the testimony of certain French agents who have been captured and are eager to cooperate with British authorities, with financial records that trace payments from French sources directly to your personal accounts," he let the words hang in the air, watching Pemberton's face grow pale as the full scope of his exposure became clear. "You have been watching me," Pemberton said. "I have been watching everyone connected to the leaked information. You simply made yourself the most obvious suspect." Alexander closed the folder with deliberate care. "The question now is whether you prefer to face these charges in a military tribunal or a civilian court." Catherine felt something shift in the air around them, a subtle change in the balance of power that had seemed so heavily weighted against her moments before. Catherine felt something shift in the air around them, a subtle change in the balance of power that had seemed so heavily weighted against her moments before. Pemberton was no longer the predator toying with his prey. He was a cornered animal, dangerous but desperate. "You cannot prove anything," Pemberton said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Whatever you think you have discovered, whatever lies my wife has told you—" "Your wife has told me very little," Alexander interrupted. "Most of what I know comes from other sources entirely. French gold has a way of leaving traces, Lord Pemberton, as do the bodies of British soldiers who died because of information you provided to their enemies." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Catherine watched Pemberton's face cycle through a series of expressions: denial, calculation, and finally a cold rage that made her step instinctively closer to Alexander. "Even if what you claim were true," Pemberton said slowly, "you forget that I am not without influence. I have friends in high places, connections that reach into the very heart of government." "They will believe the evidence," Alexander replied. "They will believe the testimony of captured French agents who can identify you personally. They will believe the financial records that show French gold flowing into your accounts. And they will believe," Catherine added quietly, "the testimony of your wife, who witnessed your meetings with French contacts, who saw you encode military dispatches in your own hand." Pemberton's eyes snapped to her face, searching for signs of deception, trying to calculate how much she actually knew versus how much she was guessing. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Justice," Alexander replied. "Full confession of your crimes, cooperation with our investigation of your French contacts, and restitution for the damage you have caused. And in return, a military tribunal rather than a public trial. a chance to die with some semblance of honor rather than being hanged as a common traitor. Pemberton stood in silence for a long moment, his face cycling through a series of expressions as he weighed his limited options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "I will confess," he said. "God help me, I will confess to everything." 6 months later, the trial of Lord Pemberton had been the sensation of London society. Catherine had testified with quiet dignity, her words carrying the weight of truth. Pemberton had been sentenced to death for treason, his estates confiscated, his name erased from the rolls of honor. Catherine had watched none of it. By the time of his execution, she was already far from London, walking in the gardens of Ravenshollow, with Alexander at her side, planning a future that belonged entirely to them. The annulment of her marriage had been a mere formality once the evidence of fraud and coercion had been presented. Society had been surprisingly forgiving of her role in the affair, perhaps because her actions had been motivated by patriotism rather than personal gain. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," Alexander said, pausing beside a bush heavy with pink blooms. "They are," Catherine agreed, though her attention was focused not on the flowers, but on the man beside her. 6 months of freedom had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She stood straighter, spoke more freely, smiled more often. "Catherine," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of formality that made her look at him more closely. He reached into his waistcoat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made her heart skip a beat. "I have been waiting for the right moment, for the trials to be over, for you to be truly free to make your own choices." He dropped to one knee there among the roses, opening the box to reveal a ring of exquisite simplicity, a single diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. "Catherine Ashworth," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his dark eyes, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need my protection, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to build a life with me?" Catherine looked down at this man who had risked everything for her, who had seen through her deceptions to the truth beneath, who had offered her not just safety but respect, not just shelter, but love. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then rose to take her in his arms. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had waited months to claim the woman he loved, tempered by the tenderness of someone who understood the value of patience. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the chapel at Ravenshollow, a small ceremony attended only by family and close friends. When Catherine walked down the aisle toward Alexander, she felt only joy, anticipation, and the deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. When the rector pronounced them husband and wife, when Alexander kissed her as the chapel erupted in applause, Catherine felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with marriage as a social institution and everything to do with finding the person who made her feel most fully herself. Later, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens where he had proposed, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked. "The choices you made, the risks you took?" Catherine considered the question seriously, thinking of all the pain and fear she had endured, all the moments when she had wondered if she would survive to see another day. "No," she said finally. "Every choice led me here, to you, to this life we are building together. I cannot regret the path that brought me such happiness." Alexander smiled, pulling her closer against his side. "Even the darkest moments, especially the darkest moments," Catherine replied. "They taught me what I was capable of, showed me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Without them, I might never have found the courage to love you as completely as I do." Atid. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenshollow, felt a peace she had never known before. She had found her place in the world, not as someone's property or problem to be solved, but as a woman who had chosen her own destiny and found it good. The past was behind them, with all its pain and deception. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise and possibility, and in this moment, surrounded by love and safety and the absolute certainty of her own worth, Catherine knew that she had made the right choice. Which choice would you have made? If this tale of courage, love, and impossible choices captivated you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Would you have chosen truth over safety? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories of love conquering all odds. Thank you for joining us at Raven's Hollow, and until our next tale unfolds, may you always choose love over fear.